The Lymphoma Voices podcast brings you a series of conversations around topics of interest for people affected by lymphoma, the fifth most common cancer in the UK.
Hello, my name is Anne Hook and I'm the Publications Manager at Lymphoma Action. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor David Linch. And today we're going to talk about the last 40 years of Lymphoma Action, because Lymphoma Action is now celebrating its 40th anniversary. And this is an opportunity for us to look back at the start of the charity and how it supported people affected by lymphoma over that time. So, hello, David.
Hello, nice to hear from you.
Can you tell me a little bit about your career?
To say I drifted would be not an accurate statement, but I didn't have any very well-developed plans at an early stage in my career. And when I became a consultant at the Middlesex Hospital, I joined Dr. Jeliffe's lymphoma team really as a learning experience, and things that just sort of happened. He retired, I took over his practice, and what followed from that was I became the director of the British National Lymphoma Investigation, and I became president of the Hodgkin's Disease Association as it was. So it wasn't well thought out. I found it enjoyable. That's what happened for me.
How many years did you work in haematology, in specialising in lymphoma?
I was appointed as a consultant in 1984, and I fully retired in 2021. So a long time.
Yeah. I hope you don't mind me starting by asking you a little bit about your involvement with the charity. Where did it all start?
Well, the charity started at the Middlesex Hospital. The consultant who was actually involved at the very beginning was Dr. Tony Jeliffe. And when he retired, I took over his practice, and sort of with taking over the clinical practice, I was asked if I'd also take over his job as president of Lymphoma Action, as it now is.
I believe at the time, was it called the Hodgkin Disease and Lymphoma Association at that time, I believe?
It was just called the Hodgkin's Disease Association.
Ah, so it's had several name changes.
Oh, it's had several, because originally it was set up, there were two patients on the cancer ward at the Middlesex Hospital, both with Hodgkin's disease, who used to talk to each other a lot about what was going on, and found that very comforting. And they spoke to their consultant, Dr. Jeliffe, and suggested to him they might set up a club for patients to talk to each other. So that happened, I think it was 1983, and they set up. And after a while, they recruited to the team Tim Hilder, who was a patient at Mount Vernon Hospital. And so he joined the team, and he took it forward a step or two and made sure it got registered as a charity. And that was really the beginnings of the association. And that was in 1985. And then the first annual general meeting of the charity was held in 1986.
Looking back at 1983, 84, 85, 86 and so on, what sort of information was available for people who had a diagnosis of lymphoma?
Very little. And it was very much up to individual hospitals, consultant centres, whether they provided any written information at all, and there was no access to internet. So it was a very mysterious diagnosis. If you told somebody they had breast cancer, they immediately knew what was involved. The average person doesn't know what the lymphatic system is. And to be told they had lymphoma was very difficult to understand. And support was very limited.
Of course, there weren't clinical nurse specialists as such at the time, but was it the nurse or would it be the consultant who would spend time explaining what the condition was and what the treatment was likely to be?
Well, I think it depends who you ask. The consultants would always tell you it was them, but it rarely was. It was the people who came behind the consultant who filled in all the gaps So the nursing staff were very important in that role.
And you said that these patients got together and were forming a sort of group and getting support from each other. How did it form, or did they meet in a room?
Well, they did meet in a room in the hospital, but it was very much having access to other people to talk to and discuss. And from the beginning, helping them was Gillian Hudson, who was another one of the doctors at the Middlesex Hospital. And she acted as a medical advisor if there were any medical questions. But right from the beginning, this was always intended to be a patient-led, patient-run organization for patients rather than having direct medical input.
Mm. And you mentioned that Tim Hilder took it on to the next stage. In what format did he do that?
So Tim didn't have Hodgkin's disease. He had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And part of the reason why they invited Tim to join the group was he had been supporting some other patients at Mount Vernon Hospital, and there was a desire to extend the role of the association to include non-Hodgkin's lymphoma as well. So he brought that side in, and Tim was very well organized. And after a couple of years, after joining the club, as it were, he became the chairman, and it was him really that took it through the administrative steps to become a registered charity.
So David, at that time when they were meeting as, I suppose what you'd say as a support group, do you get a sense of how many people were actually getting together and talking about their lymphoma at that point?
I think it was sort of half a dozen, perhaps 10 people. It was a small group.
Yeah. It sounds like they wanted to expand that so it was available for more people. Of course, we're so used to the internet and being able to be connected to people so swiftly. How to get the word out, or was it down to medics to do so? How did that happen?
I think Tony Jeliffe gave it respectability in the sense that at that time there was quite a lot of suspicion of patient-run groups, and having a senior respected medic like him involved gave them access to come to meetings where there were lymphoma doctors meeting, particularly through the British National Lymphoma Investigation, and the word spread. And the real way they got to people from the beginning was through the phone line, the helpline.
And that was set up by Tim Hilder, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah.
In his dining room or something?
Yeah, it was actually set up, as you say, in his dining room, and at times I believe it was in his garage.
So it's quite a long way from where we are now.
A very long way.
Yeah. As a clinician, what did you think was the value of this group of people meeting?
I think people found it incredibly supportive to be able to talk to people who knew what was going on and have access to people with similar problems. I think it gave people a lot of confidence, really, to be able to talk to other patients with similar problems.
Mm. And when did they start introducing information for people?
Well, obviously, from the time that the phone line started, that was all about producing information for people. It was information and support, the two together. What the date was that the written information started, I'm not sure. It was a long time ago.
Yeah. And I think I've seen things where they used to send a newsletter out quite regularly to people involved with the organisation. And were you involved in reviewing that?
No, that was, it was deliberate not to too closely involve medical people, although if there were questions they had, they would come to either Gillian Hudson or myself and ask questions, but it wasn't a sort of a routine thing.
Yeah, because I know when I sort of look back before the charity started, you know, you go to a library and find medical books, and they were very medical, and there was very little that you could find that was anything else. So that was quite a big step to then produce information for patients by patients. Can I ask you, what do you think have been the most important developments over the years for people with lymphoma through the charity?
I personally think that the thing that the association did, as it was then called, that had the greatest impact was the setting up of clinical nurse specialty. Prior to the action of the charity, most centres didn't have a nurse or nurses with that specialist expertise in lymphomas. And by setting up the system where the charity paid for a nurse for a couple of years, but only under the conditions that the hospital would then pick up the post, they managed to create a body of clinical nurse specialists throughout the country. And I think that transformed patient care by really having someone that every patient knew was their nurse, who was an expert in the field and could really give them that one-to-one, face-to-face support. So it was a really quite novel and revolutionary step, that, and I think it had enormous impact.
Yeah, I know today clinical nurse specialists are a mainstay of a lot of the haematology departments and incredibly supportive for people. Obviously, as time went on and people were getting more informed as patients, did that make your job as a clinician easier or harder, would you say?
I never thought of it in those terms. What changed was the range of questions that you would be asked, and but it was always very varied. There were always people who wanted to know intimate details of what was going on, and there still are people who choose not to. So I don't think it was harder or easier, really. It was just different.
Have you found, and do you continue to find, lymphoma a fascinating condition?
Yes, it's fascinating at the level of what the treatment is, what treatment options there are and are coming along. But it's also fascinating from just the viewpoint of the biology. We know so much more about the biology of lymphomas today. I mean, certainly when I entered the field, there were about 7 types of lymphoma. There's now the best part of 100, as we know more and more and hone down on specific entities. So scientifically, it's very interesting, although that tends to add to the confusion for many, including patients.
When people get told they've got lymphoma, people don't really understand their lymphatic system unless they've done A-level biology or beyond, really, do they? So to have a condition on something that you don't entirely understand is very confusing.
I'm sure it is. Well, I know it is, because you tell someone they have lymphoma, most people just look blank.
And, you know, today we spend a lot of time reporting on clinical trials in lymphoma. There's so many trials available for people in this area. Has that always been the case?
The clinical trials is a relatively recent phenomenon. What Dr. Jeliffe's big claim to fame, as it were, was that in 1970, he managed to get together a whole group of radiotherapists throughout the country who would form a trials organisation called the British National Lymphoma Investigation. And it was quite a unique organisation, because for the first time, every patient who entered the database was having their histology checked by a central body, so that you could be sure about the precise diagnosis. And the other thing was that patients were then followed up for life. So it gave you a real insight into the real total history of the disease. It's quite fascinating how in the early days, how the information was stored. It was all on punch cards. So these were cards, you may have seen them, with holes all the way round, and you punch out. And when you wanted to say, look at how many women under 20 had something, you put a knitting needle through age and another knitting needle through females, and you'd shake it, and all the ones you wanted would drop out and the rest would stay behind. It was pre-computing.
Yeah. The last 40 years have been obviously a change for Lymphoma Action and people with lymphoma, but goodness, the world has changed so much. That's a brilliant example with your knitting needles. And, you know, I remember there being a computer room where I used to work where you took things to be processed in a computer room, and it was very out of bounds and a huge area. Things are so different. Do you feel that that's been the case with the treatment of lymphoma? Has that kept pace with developments in other areas, do you think?
It's hard to say. I mean, the really big advances in lymphoma treatment all happened in the late 60s, early 70s. So there was a quantum leap forward. Then things hardly changed over the years, despite all the trials trying to improve treatment. But if you look at, say, diffuse large B-cell lymphomas, the most common type of lymphoma, the treatment for that in 1974 was CHOP. Now, in 2025, the treatment is CHOP plus a monoclonal antibody, rituximab. But the foundation of the treatment has really not changed. I mean, there obviously have been changes and other things have come along. If one looks at that story of CHOP, when that first came in, patients were treated on it. What has changed is people know how to give it properly, and the supportive care has improved. So supportive care has been a very important development.
And what do you mean by supportive care?
Things like treating sepsis and infections, treating people for bleeding if their platelets are low. And what used to happen was people, I'm talking about chemotherapy now, people receiving chemotherapy would, their blood counts would always drop. And sometimes before they could bounce back, people would get infections. And that terrified, I'm sure it terrified the patients, but it terrified the doctors. And often they would then reduce the treatment so it didn't happen. But that, of course, negated the power of the chemotherapy, whereas no one today would think of reducing the dose because someone had an infection, because we'd have confidence about treating that infection.
And you said there was a marked step in the 60s and 70s before that. What was that?
Well, it was really, it was the realization that chemotherapy could cure some types of cancer. And that really began in the United States in childhood leukemia, which went from being nearly 100% fatal to a curable disease. That was the first disease it was shown in acute leukemia. And then the next diseases tried were non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and Hodgkin's disease. It was all about using combinations of drugs, which were much more efficacious than just single drugs on their own. And so that all came in round about that period of time.
You know, a charity organisation like Lymphoma Action was trying to keep a pace with all these things, with information. By then, I'm guessing we were doing support groups. You've mentioned the clinical nurse specialist. And today we have online support groups, Facebook groups, lots of different areas. Are there areas that you think would have been valuable for a charity to have offered support in that hasn't happened?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there were, at least to me, there were no obvious holes in the portfolio.
Of course, you were president of the charity for a while. You headed up our medical advisory panel for a long period of time. And in fact, it got set up relatively recently in the history of Lymphoma Action. That medical advisory panel and yourself have been absolutely instrumental in making it possible for us to provide accurate, evidence-based, up-to-date information about lymphoma. So we've been very indebted to you and that group over the years and continue to do so. David, we've talked about the impact of the medical advisory panel. And as a charity, I know we work more and more closely with healthcare professionals, you know, not only the medical advisory panel, but beyond that, healthcare professionals. And one of the areas that we've been also expanding into is training for clinicians and nurses. And I wondered what you thought about that.
I think it's been a fantastic program. I mean, once a body of clinical nurse specialists was set up, it became an obvious move to continue to educate those nurses who came in not as necessarily lymphoma specialists, but within a shorter period of time had to be very expert to answer people's questions. And that also, in those early days of those education meetings, was very much a support group for the clinical nurse specialists at the same time. And then there was a further step forward to take on the training of junior doctors. And it's incredibly appreciated by the junior doctors to have these courses with such concentrated teaching. And in the long run, I do believe that must feed through into improved patient care.
Has the impact of lymphoma on the individual changed over the last 40 years, do you think, David?
I think the impact is the same, but everyone's an individual, and what happens to them is an individual thing. Although the impacts of different events may be similar, they're probably happening to less people than they used to as the results of treatment improved. But the actual nature of the impact, I think, for those who are affected is similar.
You've mentioned what you think are the most important areas of the charity's work, which I know you feel with the clinical nurse specialists. Looking forward, is there any area that you can foresee us going into that might be different, or do you think we cover everything we should?
What I would say is the most contentious area is to what extent the organisation should be a political body lobbying governments and hospitals and whatever. And I think that's how far one takes that is sort of quite a challenge for the future.
And do you think that's one of the key roles that we should be going forward as? Do you think we should be the mouthpiece of people with lymphoma to try and lobby change? And
I have mixed feelings about it. In general, I think the answer is yes to some extent, but I do think there's a danger of getting waylaid by that process so that it takes one away from the purpose of supporting individuals. So I sit on the fence on that one.
Do you think there'll ever come a time when charities won't need to exist to support patients?
No. Actually, when you're looking to support patients with information and just emotional support, there's actually advantages for that information support to be coming from independent organisations who aren't part of their care package. It gives a sort of an independence to the process, which I think is very valuable.
And do you feel that we've stayed true to the reason that, well, what was the Hodgkin's disease and is now Lymphoma Action? You know, if we stay true to our purpose, do you feel?
Yeah, I think it's a phenomenal success story, you know, and long may it continue.
I've got one more question I wanted to ask,
Yes,
which is our
do.
extra bonus question that we do ask most people. If there was one message you wanted to give to people with lymphoma, what would it be?
To be open and discuss it with their family and not try and hide away from what's going on.
Professor Linch, thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, as always, to be involved with the charity. Thank you.
For more information about lymphoma and the support we can offer to people affected by the condition, please visit the Lymphoma Action website at www.lymphoma-action.org.uk. Lymphoma Action. Inform, support, connect.